Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm going to take you on a fast tour of my life. Fasten your seatbelts. I should have had 2 hours for this talk. So there I am. I started off, standing out in the crowd, as you might say. In Dartmouth, I learned that vaccines were wonderful. Do them. In residency, I learned how to do lumbar punctures. This was in the mid-'80s, and we were seeing a lot of meningitis. There were actually cases in the hospital at all times, and it felt like the Hib vaccine that was added my last year of training actually seemed to make a difference. So I'm still a fan. I woke up at a DAN conference in 2003 in Portland, Oregon, or maybe it was 2002, and seeing videos of kids regressing, kid after kid after kid after kid, normal at 1 or 18 months and then just totally gone. I was bawling my eyes out. But I thought, no problem, we got the mercury out of the vaccine, so the problem solved. Unfortunately, we also moved the hepatitis B vaccine. We used to give it to teenagers. In my practice, that same year was when that happened. So we got rid of the mercury, we added more aluminum. My patients weren't doing very well. In fact, we all know this. Our children aren't doing very well. If you look at 20 pediatric chronic diseases, endemic since the 80s, 43% of US children are affected. The annual cost is $500 billion just for autism, food allergies, asthma, and ADHD. We're seeing this. I know you're seeing this. What was the last straw for me was a kid I'm going to call Jack. This was in November of 2007. So I was still in my old group practice with 4 other pediatricians, and I walk into a 2-year-old well visit. I'd seen him at 1, my nurse practitioner had seen him at 18 months, and you know those little tiny push strollers? He was sitting with his back to the window facing me and just like that. Jack, how you doing? Nothing. He was gone, completely gone, no language, no social, stimming. He's severe to this day. He's in his early teens about. And I thought back, this was my 4th case in 4 years in my practice that I helped create, right? I caused this. I mean, I ordered the vaccines, right? So I couldn't do it any longer. Went to my partners and said, I can't do business as usual. I had already done a lot of my own research and Defeat Autism Now conferences. It was like, can't do this anymore. Anyway, I was shown the door, and that was the best thing that ever happened to me. We started integrative pediatrics, and I started what I'm now calling the vaccine-friendly plan. No vaccines in pregnancy. No hepatitis B unless mom has hepatitis B herself. The kids in my practice as newborns are not having sex, and they're not sharing needles, and 100% of my moms for the last 25 years have been hepatitis B negative. I haven't had a single mom. I also do some addiction work, and I've since had a mom who's an addict, needle sharer, who was positive, but we're just not seeing it. There's no polio in America, so we're putting that one off. Rotavirus made no sense from the beginning, never has. I'll show you some data soon about why that really makes no sense. And you know, in my 30 years of pediatrics, I have not seen a single case of hepatitis A. We know it's happening, but it's subclinical. You know, kids get it and they get better. So that one is not necessary, certainly not that young. If you are going to vaccinate, only 1 aluminum containing at a time. And the MMR, I'd been to enough of these conferences, I'd heard Wakefield speak, and yeah, it's controversial, whatever. I just couldn't do it that early. I was going to wait till 3. It's turned out that was probably a good choice. And wait till at least school age on chickenpox. If you have a family history of autism or autoimmune disease or developmental delays, and if at any time you have a child who's starting to regress or showing problems, you stop all further vaccines. That's the vaccine-friendly plan. It's in my book. This is sort of what it looks like if you took the AAP schedule and you blow it out into a vaccine-friendly plan, so to speak. The friendliest vaccine plan is none, by the way. But this book was written to take people who are so invested in the status quo and the CDC and the AAP schedule. You tell those people do nothing, you can't reach them. So at least this book will help you start to think. We've got to start thinking. This is what a pediatric office was like. Don't try to turn tail and run. That's just what they want. So I'm going to show you a little bit of data from my practice. In February of 2015, I'd been in practice for almost 8 years at Integrative Pediatrics. I created a data set. I got an IRB to do this, and we had group 1 was those who followed that plan or slower, because what would happen is you'd start to see something of concern and we would stop. So actually, almost none of that 1,098 patients got that full vaccine-friendly plan, but they got some vaccines. Group 2 was families with no vaccines. Today, I'm getting new families every day, and almost all of them don't want any vaccines. So I'm going to have to redo some data, because we're going to... You know, when you give people choices, the smart ones make good choices. Group 3 was my most vaccinated. Now, very few of these were actually CDC scheduled, because they're coming to my practice because they're worried. But they're more vaccinated. They got the Hep B as newborns typically. A lot of times they got the whole Hep B series. And you can see, autism or ASD, it was only in the most vaccinated group. And that last column there, lost diagnoses, this is important, because what I did with my study is I hired 2 medical students who spent 2 summers going chart by chart, note by note, documenting every single thing that was documented. So we found a lot of little delays and things like that. And, but we also found that some kids lost their diagnosis. And I think that was because of integrative medicine approaches and slowing down the vaccine schedule. So if you look over on the far side here, I just point this out. Developmental delays. The only group that had a significant decrease was the completely unvaccinated. If you're born into my practice, your rate of autism was less. That just reflects integrative medicine things. And then I don't do rotavirus. I never have. And I thought, what's that going to show? I wanted to look at that data. And so you'll see it's interesting for, uh-oh, I almost messed this up. For diarrhea, it was only the most vaccinated group that had any rotavirus kids, because I don't do it and I don't have it at my office. So we had 218 compared to a much larger group who hadn't had rotavirus. But diarrhea, much higher. Gastroenteritis, much higher. ER visits were slightly elevated in this group, and kind of a wash on hospitalizations. I'm finding from this data that, and there are other studies that show this, that the rotavirus vaccine is more trouble than it's worth. The vaccine-friendly plan book starts with a chapter on toxins. I think it's a lot of toxins that are the problem. I want to talk about informed consent. If we let go of informed consent, we have lost our role as physicians, because then anybody can just follow a protocol. So we have got to do proper informed consent. This involves talking about the risks, the benefits, and the alternatives. Our challenge with our peers is they don't even know the risks, right? Because they know that vaccines are safe and effective, so that's end of story. So we've got our job cut out for us on educating on vaccine risks. Coercion occurs when an overt threat of harm is intentionally presented by one person to another in order to obtain compliance. This is going on in practices across this country. I get patients who are discharged from my peers in Portland, Oregon, all the time. It's ridiculous. So it's do as I say or you're out. That's unethical in my opinion. So we need to first do no harm. In Oregon, we had Senate Bill 442. We went and testified like you guys did, and we were just lucky, I think. Somehow we had enough momentum and they didn't have enough force. We're not so fortunate here in California, Senate Bill 277, no vaccine, no daycare, no school. Everybody gets all the vaccines. It's a mess. Here's what's happened to our schedule. It's just blown up, right? This is something that's just not normal. Physicians for Informed Consent, some of the leaders you're seeing and you're sitting out here, thank you for what you're doing. The mission is to unite doctors who oppose mandatory vaccine laws and educate the public on infectious disease, the immune system, and informed consent. She got a standing applause in the other room, so I won't do it to her again, but man, this woman works so hard, I can't believe it. In fact, I've talked to her husband, I said, do you ever see her? And he has to make appointments to see her. Yeah, let's give it to Shira. This is another one of our unsung heroes. Greg Glasser is, all right, give it up. If you're a physician, if you're a parent, he's the guy that oftentimes is going to give you legal advice, and I think it's always for free, which I don't know how he does that. And then Tatiana, those of you who haven't joined yet, on at least once a month, we have a free educational seminar that is, bar none, the most phenomenal education I've ever participated in. And she just does this to help our organization. Thank you, Tatiana. You're going to hear from her later. So I don't have to tell everybody in this room, autism's on the rise. This was here in California. I read the Sacramento Bee. I was visiting my aunt at the time, and 7% increase. We have almost 100,000 autistic kids here in California in the public school system, a 7% increase year to year, 12% in the Sacramento area, and a 17% statewide year to year in kindergarten. I think we should mandate more vaccines. This is what's happening. It continues. Something needs to be done. This is my wife with my first child, and I just have to talk about vaccines in pregnancy because it is the most insane thing one could do. However, you can go to the CDC website and they will tell you that it's a really good thing. There are no safety studies on either of the two vaccines, but there's all these resources at the CDC. You go to your OBGYN office, these posters are up. I can get them for free. You can all get them for free for your offices and promote these vaccines. Well, let's examine the CDC statements. Facts about the Tdap. Provides the best protection. There are no studies to show this, to back this up. Let's talk briefly about pertussis, because that's why they're doing this vaccine. That's why they're pushing this real hard. Well, how many kids are dying of pertussis anyway? So in 2015, there were 5 total. We have 4 million births a year. This is the whole push to vaccinate and basically poison every pregnancy. It's insanity. It started in 2012. This was a glitch year where we had a whole lot more pertussis than any other year. I had 20 cases in my practice that year. I had probably less than 10 cases my entire career, and 20 cases in 2012. So this was an atypical year, but this is the data they're going to report, and you're going to hear, oh, it's a big problem. There were 15 deaths in infants under 3, which is why they made the change from cocooning. Let's try to get moms protected, but it's all about selling vaccines. Postpartum admission, they say it's not optimal. Well, it might be better than injecting the mom while she's pregnant. And cocooning, one study showed some benefit, although at one of those wonderful Tatiana seminars, we got other studies that showed, may not work. Shouldn't be offered as part of preconception care. I don't know why. That makes no sense. And there's no safety studies. Oh, but wait. There are safety studies, the CDC says. Here they are. I took out the 15, 20 slides that went through all these studies. I've read them all. I've looked at them. They're garbage. They're looking at birth weight. They're looking at things that don't matter. One of the study actually shows a significant increase in chorioamnionitis, and I did the math. We would have about 20 deaths per year out of our 4 million births from chorio to save how many deaths from pertussis? 5 to 10. It just doesn't add up at all. The other problem is perinatal mercury. That was addressed in the prior talk. 80% of flu shots have thimerosal, and you just can't inject this. It makes no sense. It lowers IQ. How about the flu shot? They're pushing that for every pregnancy, sometimes twice, right? It might be 2 seasons your pregnancy traverses. And there's no studies, once again. The ingredients in the flu shots, based on the brand, it kind of looks like a who's who of what you would put in a bioweapon or something. It's just ridiculous. So all these flu deaths, which, by the way, they're not all flu. I'll get to that in a moment. Do we have these studies that are comparing all these things, side effects? Well, here's one. They were unable to demonstrate the effectiveness of vaccination with data from hospital admissions or physician admits. Here's the effectiveness of this vaccine over here. You can see down here. Nothing very exciting. I wouldn't want that to be your birth control pill. This is a study, if you haven't seen, you should get it. It's the one that, to me, just sort of rang it home for me. This was a big study done in England over a 5-year period. They had 10,000 patient years, and you'll notice out of those 10,000, you've got 81% did not get the flu, were not infected at all. 13% were asymptomatic, and you get down to this very tiny fraction of a percent who actually even had a problem. What they did was pretty thorough. They did preseason, postseason serology, weekly illness reporting, PCR confirmation from nasal swabs, tracked it for those 5 years with this cohort in England from 2006 to 11, and 3/4 were asymptomatic, less than 1% even bothered to see a doctor, and there were only 2 deaths, and those deaths were in completely vaccinated older people. I'm not sure we need this vaccine. There have been increased gestational diabetes and eclampsia, and this particular study just came out this year, and the headline and all the reporting on it is that this shot is safe for pregnancy. But if you actually read the study, you'll see there was a significant increase in first trimester, increased risk for autism. And yet they don't report it that way. So my other big pet peeve is hepatitis B. This one, oh my gosh, it's ridiculous. So if you go to MMWR, those mortality tables, you can see that we have less than 50 deaths per year for infants. That's out of 4 million births, and none of them are if you're hepatitis B negative. Your risk is 0. Why are we injecting every single woman in the country? So this is the table where I got it from MMWR, but it's interesting to think about the whole country, all ages. Total cases about 2,500 out of 324 million people in this country for a rate of 1 in 130,000. CDC quotes 1 in 100 pregnant moms. I think it's way less than that. This vaccine could probably go away and it would be just fine. So here's the other problem with the hepatitis B. We're all told to get it, but it's not giving lasting protection. If you're a doctor and you were vaccinated as an infant, these must be some young doctors, only 16% of them still had titers. If you're a teenager, only 24% still had protective titers. The vaccine has a lot of aluminum. What other studies do we have? There's entire books on aluminum toxicity. We know a lot about it. I'm going to be covering something that I hadn't been aware of initially, but I think it's really, really important when you're thinking about aluminum toxicity, because this is where people get confused and then we stumble over our own feet. And that is dissolved aluminum versus nanoparticle aluminum that's in the vaccines. So most of the early studies were done on hyperal that were contaminated with aluminum. And we knew here from this study that you had blood levels and bone deposition at levels of 14 to 18 per kilo. Aluminum exposure and toxicity in neonates, they showed that you had oxidative stress and cell death. There's a lot of the truth hidden from us. I've quoted the Bishop study for a long time because I really think this was the one that caused the first real alarms about aluminum levels. But remember, this is still dissolved aluminum. They compared kids who got 45 micrograms per kilogram to those who got 5 micrograms per kilogram and looked at their developmental outcome with Bailey scales. And for each day these neonates who were on hyperal got the higher level, they lost a point on the Bailey developmental score. So for every day, they're losing a point just based on this toxicity. So that woke the FDA up, and they made this recommendation. This document is still up and live today, not to exceed 5 micrograms per kilogram per day. But remember, this is dissolved aluminum. So immune challenges early in development, including those that are vaccine-induced, can lead to permanent detrimental alterations of the brain. It accumulates in bone and brain, other places as well. And I thought this was fascinating. A quarter of the injected aluminum is present at 2 weeks. And how about this? Half of that aluminum is there 7 years later. We have a half-life of 7 years. So we're loading these kids up with aluminum-containing vaccines their entire infancy. Just imagine that's going to be there till they're young adults, if not longer. It interferes with cellular metabolism, information transfer, lipid peroxidation, makes cells vulnerable to free radicals. We've got this study showing increased autism. Injected rats were dying, long-term neurological outcome problems. This study that showed that boys given hepatitis B in the first month of life had an increased autism rate. And of course, we know it's not providing lasting immunity. One of our own pediatricians here did this amazing, I can't show it because we're running out of time. I want to talk to you about the MITCA study. If you're going to talk aluminum, you've got to understand this study. And I'm going to show you a graph that's super important. Notice it was done based on orally ingested aluminum. We know that about 97% of that is excreted, so you're only absorbing 3%. The aluminum nanoparticles in vaccines are not really dissolving. A little bit of it, I think it's a fraction of a percent, gets into blood and solution. So we got to spend, this is the only time I go slow. We have got to understand this graph. So where's my pointer? Here we go. Here's your body burden of aluminum in milligrams. Here's the days, age of life from birth through the first year. And then these two curves right here, these are based on no observed adverse effects. However, they picked one study and one study only that showed there was no observed adverse effect at 26 micrograms per kilogram. The pink line is the 5th percentile for weight for these infants. The blue line is the 50th. And of course, here's your aluminum in the body based on the little bit you get from diet and from mom and from breast milk. And then the vaccine aluminum, remember the nanoparticles are not really dissolving very much, a fraction of a percent. But it does sort of slowly dissolve, and then you're getting vaccines, and it's kind of staying. And you can see this, don't ignore these lines down here for a moment. These are the curves that were used by all the CDC, the FDA to say aluminum's completely safe. You can give as many vaccines as you want. There's a problem. We have, around this time and since that time, we've got studies showing that there are problems at 3.4 milligrams per kilo per day. These are the new curves if you draw in 3.4 milligrams per kilo per day. And I give credit to vaccinepapers.org. The guy that runs that site is quite a scientist, and you can get access to a lot of good stuff there. But when you factor in the fact that we now know it's not as safe as we thought it was, the entire first year of life, kids who are getting vaccines on the CDC schedule are living way above the safe levels. Right? They're way above the minimum risk levels. So this is the problem with dissolved aluminum. There's an even bigger problem with aluminum. Injected aluminum, think of it like it's little metal pieces. They don't dissolve. They're nanoparticles, and they're designed to stick around and really irritate the tissue. If you give a lot of vaccines, you've seen those reactions, right? Big red reactions, swelling. What that is macrophages. So we inject it. The macrophages come in, that's white blood cells. This has got to go. Macrophages can move through blood, can cross into the brain, and they don't live forever. They're going to die and release what? Those little pieces of aluminum metal. And this is the Trojan horse mechanism to take aluminum that we're injecting that can't dissolve very quickly and getting it to places like brain, bone, kidney, whatever. And this whole aspect of aluminum toxicity hasn't been addressed. And I think it's a big, big piece of the puzzle on top of the whole problem with dissolved aluminum. I just want you to be aware of this because some people will say, that whole theory is bunk, because look, this particular study looked at lower dose aluminum injections and found cerebral concentrations were higher than in high dose injections. See, I always used to try to pick the vaccine with the least amount of aluminum. It just seemed to make sense to me. Well, I don't know. I don't know if that even matters, because the theory, and we need more studies, but the theory is that really high-dose aluminum vaccine, it's so much aluminum that the body just sends in and encapsulates it. You get those lumps that you'll see sometimes in vaccine kids. That might explain this. Obviously, it needs more research. There's slow CCL2 dependent translocation of biopersistent particles from muscle to brain. So they're finding that this aluminum can move around. Biopersistent. Remember, they're nanoparticles. I kind of covered all this, but it's creating an ongoing inflammation. Shaw's study showed we have motor neuron death at just 100 micrograms per kilogram. We have learning and memory impairment at 300 micrograms per kilogram, and difficulty walking at 550 micrograms per kilogram. Here's how much is in the birth dose. And up to 6 months, there's a lot of aluminum. And remember, the stuff that's in your body, half-life 7 years, it's sticking around. There's another super important topic, and Dr. Orient talked about it over lunch, and that's immune activation. And I think this, folks, is probably the common mechanism for so much trouble we're seeing in all the chronic disease. So we know that infection in pregnancy is causing autism and schizophrenia. We've got immune activation shifting us into a more allergic state from Th1 to Th2, increased IL-6 expression. There seems to be a common pathway with this. So the presence of neuroinflammatory changes suggests there might be a common pathogenic mechanism. Here's what these brains are looking like. The autistic brains have a lot more inflammation going on. These were rat studies, and they just showed that you could stimulate immune activation in the pregnant rat and show that the male pups had decreased social activation. They avoided social communications. They didn't want to interact with anybody. So it's a definite active mechanism. So here's another one. They did it with rhesus monkeys, and they were able to mimic autistic-like behaviors. We already heard at lunchtime about infections during pregnancy being associated with immune activation, increased interleukin-6. This was just published and mentioned at lunchtime. Herpes simplex virus 2, increased IgGs during pregnancy, increase your odds of autism. So postnatal immune activation has been shown. It's not just you're getting it during pregnancy. We can affect children's brains even after birth. So early life immune activation, well established to regulate the program of brain development and influence behavior later in life. This is a staining of IL-6 in autistic brains, cerebellum, and look at the difference. It's just, these brains are very activated. Here's the study showing, I mean, look at the magnitude of these changes between autistic brains and controls. So how can this happen? Well, look at this. Synaptogenesis, right here, is sure, it starts before birth, but a lot of it is happening after birth, as is all the pruning and a lot of the myelination. So the brain is still in active development after birth, and we have to be careful what we do, not to overstimulate the immune system. And the immune system itself, right? We've got the whole bacterial colonization of the gut issue, but we've got maturation and T-cell issues. This is all happening after birth. This is kind of cool. It just shows that you can have postnatal effect on immune activation. And they looked at the BCG vaccine and found that it actually is reducing these inflammatory markers, IL-6, tumor necrosis factor, and the hepatitis B vaccine is raising them. Maybe we need to go back to giving the BCG. So I think this is the common mechanism. You give a vaccine, you get immune activation, you might get febrile seizures, but you're getting increased IL-6, and somehow there's a link here with this inflammation and autism. You can also get it from direct aluminum toxicity, elevating IL-6 and autism. We've got dysregulated axonal growth. This is a review article. And then there's also this cross-reactivity, the autoimmune syndrome, Asia. I mean, the Schoenfeld's book. There is so many studies showing that our immune systems are getting confused. And I think we're just doing too much to an early and young, immature immune system. Autoantibodies. With cross-reactivity, they found that 23% of mothers of ASD kids had this compared to 1% of controls. There's definitely an immune mechanism to what we're seeing. I think it has to do with more than autism. It's probably almost every autoimmune condition. This is part of the issue. Now, what about the MMR? Because a lot of us have seen the MMR trigger autism, right? It doesn't have aluminum. So what's up with that aluminum theory? Well, I didn't know this till recently, but there's this little, oh dear, sorry about that, hit the wrong button. Okay, there's this little guy, macrophage monocyte chemotactic protein, MCP1. The transport of aluminum is governed by the immune system, and this little protein activates the movement of aluminum. And so it is activated by MMR. So I think what's happened is we've loaded these kids up with aluminum, and then when you give that MMR, it's like pouring gas on a fire, and that brain that was just hanging in there is just overloaded. So we know that vaccines and febrile seizures, the varicella and the MMR combined, MMR alone, 1 in 5,000 rate. MMR with chickenpox, never give those two together. 1 in 2,500. And look at the number of ER visits after the 12-month vaccination series. That's a bad visit if you've got a little kid and you're doing the CDC schedule. They're giving aluminum-containing vaccines and 2 live virus vaccines, MMR and chickenpox, typically all at once. It's insanity. What we need, I think, are some studies comparing vaccinated with unvaccinated. And we need to get as many of those going as possible because the answers are going to be crystal clear once we do. So I'm always watching for these. I heard this one was coming, and the Mawson study, they actually got the abstract up on a Thursday or Friday, and by Monday morning, the whole thing was down. I found out from folks that actually the CDC apparently told them they had to take it down or it was going to affect public health. So you can't even get this stuff published. But I have the information because I had the copy before it was released. So here's what they found. You've got a huge increase in developmental disorders, Huge increase in autism spectrum, ADHD, learning disabilities, allergies. Incredible, right? The difference between vaccinated and unvaccinated. You guys know about this article, Brian Hooker in Translational Neurodegeneration. I read that right after it came out. I was so excited. It's like, yes, we're finally getting some data. And, but I thought, I bet this doesn't last, and it didn't. It was pulled. We have whistleblower William Thompson, who put up this statement. I regret that our co-authors omitted statistically significant information in our article. So this article in pediatricians read the journal called Pediatrics. And this proved that there was no link between MMR and autism. Come to find out all this time that they had destroyed data, manipulated the study design, and there's tons of link between the MMR and autism. That's what he had published. That's what got retracted. Del, are you still here? He's outside. Man, I wanted to give kudos to this guy. Vaxxed, if you haven't seen it, you have got to watch. That's just a documentary, and I can't get my pediatricians to go see it. I had a friend who I thought he was a friend. I said, hey, I'm going to be speaking after the movie. Come take a look at this movie. He says, oh, that movie? Why would I go see that? That's just propaganda. They don't even want to know. So there's lots of things coming up, but I just have to highlight this one because I'm going. March 31st, I got a call a month ago. It says, will you come speak at a press conference in Washington, D.C.? So we're going to have a press release that morning, and then there's going to be a rally that afternoon outside the White House. Feel free to join us if you can. I do have a letter that I'm going to put together. I've got a lot of help on it because I'm not very organized, but we're going to get this letter done in the next few days, and anybody that's willing to sign on, it will be public, so you've got to be willing to stick your name on there. But you know how the AA put out a letter with like all the chapters and all these AMA, and everybody's saying, don't look at vaccines, they're safe. Well, we want to counter that, have a letter to Trump and to Congress that says we support you in your Vaccine Safety Commission. So, this is the SurveyMonkey link that I'll send to people. If you're able to copy it down, I'll leave that up. It'll get your signature onto the letter, and we'll get copies of the letters to anybody, obviously, that's willing to sign on. At one of my websites, I have so many scientific articles up for you. All the abstracts that are in just about everything you need to look up. drpaulapproved.com, just go to the references and you can get all the abstracts of just about anything you need. And that's a really good book. You probably should have. Oh, that's a really good book. Not really. No, I think it has value for people who want to do the whole schedule. People are saying that this changed, it starts the conversation. That was the intent. And then once you understand things, you probably won't vaccinate at all. Love from my family. We adopted a bunch of kids, and I just about killed my wife, I think, but that's my wife. She's here today. Thank you very much.